In a fairly bold move, BioWare has recently spoiled a major plot point to the beginning of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, and one that is likely to have some of the most important consequences for the rest of the game. Normally, games, and especially very hyped up games with big releases, like the player to go in completely blind, and not experience things that could be considered spoilers. But to recap, we now know that Solus will be trapped in the Fade after Rook attempts to interrupt his ritual, which accidentally leads to the release of 2 of the Evanurus, and Solus acts as an advisor and/or voice in the head of Rook as they become permanently linked, with Rook's blood having mingled with the magic of the ritual. It might even be the case that Rook and Solus are inextricably linked in the sense of their lives depending on each other, though I'm speculating here. And if this were true, it would be eerily reminiscent of Johnny Silverhand's relationship with V in Cyberpunk 2077. We'll just have to wait and see. But as I said, it's a fairly bold move, and one that was clearly done for a reason, if not for several. If I had to guess, there are 2 primary reasons for this. The first is that BioWare is aware that a large contingent of people are very familiar with the lore, and desire to experience more of it, or perhaps better put, a climax to it, especially as it concerns Solus, who is one of, if not the most pivotal figures in the history of Thedas. Everyone wants to know what happens next, including myself, and massive spoilers of the sort that were featured in Game Informer whet the appetite immensely, thus ensuring first-day purchases. Dragon Age: The Veilguard is almost guaranteed to be the most important title in the series concerning some of the biggest mysteries of Thedas. Letting us know something as big as this makes us more likely to purchase the game to discover those mysteries. The second reason is intimately tied to the first, in the sense that it's been 10 years of waiting, and in that time, much has happened to BioWare. Many failures have been documented, from Andromeda to Anthem to mass cuts and firings. Public faith in BioWare has been at an all-time low, and BioWare needed to do something that could reinstill that faith in their fans, former or otherwise, by revealing such a key plot point, as Solus becoming effectively the advisor to Rook, the protagonist, and the Evanurus escaping. BioWare is trying to show the world that big things and big events are happening in this game, and that they mean business. And truly from a marketing perspective, I don't think it's that bad an idea, and I think that Dragon Age: The Veilguard will likely end up selling pretty well overall. All of that said, that doesn't mean that all of us were incredibly happy with some of the details revealed in that Game Informer article, and indeed a more recent Game Informer article shed even more light upon the plot of Rook's relationship to Solus, essentially telling us exactly what the relationship will look like in terms of its mechanics, though not necessarily in its details. The article also stresses several important points of Solus's place in the game, which is likely talked about because prior to these most recent revelations, most of us had assumed Solus would be the big enemy in the game. So let's check out some of these highlights from the article. Though Johnny Solashand is no longer the main enemy, he still remains important. Quote, Solus is still a central figure in it. He's still a significant character, but really, the focus shifts to the team. It's about the people you recruit. It's about stopping the end of the world with this group of specialists, these incredibly interesting and diverse characters that you recruit into your team. We realize Dreadwolf suggests a title focused on a specific individual, whereas The Veilguard, much like Inquisition, focuses on the team. So here we again hear that the reason for the name shift was reflective of the importance of the team you're building and leading in Dragon Age: The Veilguard. But we kind of already knew that, so what's the really big reveal? Quote, when I ask about Solus's role in the story, after I learn his namesake is no longer in the game title, Dara says Veilguard is still taking the Elven Gods narrative in a good direction. He adds, it allows us to hopefully give a good conclusion to all those varied attitudes towards Solus that are going to be coming from people who love Solus, who agree with Solus, who hate Solus, people who want to kick Solus off a building. I think that we give you the opportunity to bring that to a close, and then tell a greater story about The Veilguard, and about the world as a whole. Talking to Epler, I learned more about how Solus isn't exactly the big bad I expected before seeing the opening hours of Veilguard. There's a lot more nuance to everyone's favorite bald elf. Quote, the most interesting villains to myself, and honestly most people, are not just straight up, I want to end the world. To them, they are the heroes of the story, and Solus is no exception, Epler tells me. Solus always feels that he is a tragic hero, but a hero nonetheless. So he's coming into this firmly believing that what he did, that which you stopped him from doing, was the right thing, that you made a mistake. but now he's trapped and can't reach out and actively affect Thetis, so he needs to work with you. That allows us to provide a lot of nuance to that relationship, Epler says. If you're wondering what Epler means when he says Solus is trapped, it's quite literal. In the game's prologue, which is part of the 20-minute gameplay segment BioWare recently released, the player character Rook and companions Lace Harding, Varric Tethris, and Neve Gelos stop Solus's attempt to destroy the Veil, a barrier between the magical Fade and Thetis. I won't spoil exactly what happens here, but Rook passes out moments later and wakes up in a dreamlike landscape to the voice of Solus himself, because he's trapped here. Cue Johnny Solashand. He explains that he was tempted to move Elgar'nan and Gil-Lanain, both of whom are parts of the Evernuris, or elven gods of ancient times, to a new prison because the old one was no longer containing them properly. Unfortunately for Solus, he's trapped here, the Fade, by our doing, and Elgar'nan and Gil-Lanain are free, blighted, and roaming Thetis. It's up to Rook to stop them, but it seems they'll have to work with Solus, or at least listen to his guidance and advice to do so. Epler says players will see early on as the narrative develops across Veilguard that Solus sees much of himself in you, the player-controlled Rook, especially the parts that maybe he doesn't like to face. As a result, there's an interesting push and pull between Solus and Rook. He says players can define the relationship between these two characters with their choices in dialogue. Quote, "You can continue to be suspicious and hostile towards him, or you can start to see him and find that common ground, that connection between the two of you, and really develop a different relationship over the course of the story," Epler says. Okay, all of this confirms something significant. Solus is effectively a Johnny Solashand advisor to you. It also seems that Johnny Solashand is going to be able to telepathically communicate with you, and in some sense is basically stuck inside your head, just like Johnny Silverhand is in V's head. And I have to wonder if this entire setup is just a coincidence or something more. I'm still not sure how I feel about Solus in an advisory position, being removed from an original expectation as the primary villain. A complicated villain to be sure, but still a villain. Nevertheless, we're stuck with what we have. I think it's still possible to have a decent story evolve from the initial bloopers on the part of both Solus and Rook, and I still think it's possible for Johnny Solashand to be the villain we've always imagined him to be, at least in part. It would be unreasonable for us, for example, to assume that just because Johnny Solashand is now trapped in the Fade, that he's completely given up his original plan. But of course, he has to have his priorities. He obviously cannot allow the Evernuris to escape, who've been let loose to rampage across Thetis, but that doesn't mean he cannot nudge Rook in certain directions that would be beneficial to Solashand's long-term and ultimate plan. This is particularly true if Rook is a mage, or even more so an elf, or perhaps even more so than all of that, an elven mage veil jumper. Perhaps an elven character could be convinced of Solus's vision and plan, in much the way Solus's female elven inquisitor lover could be convinced, and that too is a factor as we know that the Inquisitor will play some important role in the game, not least of which with Johnny Solashand. Maybe the Inquisitor is sympathetic to Solus. BioWare has hinted that the relationship between Rook and Johnny Solashand could get quite complex and deep, so depending on how this is done, it could actually be quite good, despite the fact that this could have been set up much better. You take what you can get, and perhaps most importantly in all of this is the fact that Rook needs Solus. He's one of the most powerful mages that has ever lived and has succeeded in imprisoning immortal elven mages who would be gods. His knowledge is absolutely essential to defeating Elgar'nan and Gil-Lanain, and again, he may or may not reveal everything he knows to Rook in an effort to steer things in a direction he desires. So I would say that although this beginning in my view is a fairly rough start, and I could have thought of several other ways of starting the game, it's also not the worst in the sense that Johnny Solashand's role remains essential. And if the writing is good, there still could be depth, subtlety, and I truly hope some subversion of expectations. This is true as thus far, so much of what has been revealed seems to be a confirmation of every theory all the most devoted lore mongers of Dragon Age have come up with, and props to them for being correct. But I'd really like to be surprised as well and have my expectations subverted by finding out things we didn't expect or know. There are, of course, many critical lore-related questions I expect to be answered in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, so at least it has that going for it. But that's a topic for another video and another time. Thank you all for watching. If you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.